Hey guys, and welcome back to a brand new video. Now today's video is a requested video for one of our subscribers. He messaged me on Instagram a few days ago and he said, can we do a video on how to edit like ERIK CONOVER? So I have agreed to do this. So here is his account. He's a male model. He's based in New York. We've got a really interesting feed. Obviously most of his photos are kind of like more like model photos, like kind of showing off clothing and stuff. But again, a really interesting feed and a really interesting look. So we're going to go ahead and try and do a particular edit today, and we're going to be basing it on this photo here. Okay, so before I jump straight into today's video, first of all, I want to talk to you quickly about our website. So if you're new to our channel, don't forget, go ahead and click subscribe now, because we will be bringing out loads of videos to the channel this month. Loads of Photoshop videos and loads of Lightroom videos, and there's bound to be something coming out for you. So do go ahead and turn on that bell icon and subscribe now. Now, if you have been around for a while, you will know that we sell presets and Lightroom presets and Photoshop actions, but I thought I'd show you our website at the moment. So we have basically a load of Lightroom presets here you can go ahead and purchase. These are usually in the style of like one of your favorite Instagrammers. We've got a sale going on our massive bundle pack here at the moment. But what I do want to tell you about is our new merchandise line that we literally released a couple of days ago, depending on when this video goes up. But we will do a video entirely on it, but I'm just going to talk to you guys really quickly about it at the beginning of this video. So this is the merchandise kind of page. There's men's and women's. The hoodies are unisex, so are basically for men and women, but we thought we'd put a women's section on here as well. So I'm just going to show you one or two examples. So this is one of our hoodies. It's like this design here, which I think is really quite cool. You can get it in black, grey or white. Do go ahead and check this out though on the website. I will put the links down below so you guys can go ahead and check it out. But that one is one of my favourite ones. Then this one is kind of more of a fun, random design. I'm not really sure why we did it, but it's basically a load of monsters just chilling on a jumper here. So it's really quite a fun look. If you wanted something more kind of random and more fun, you can go ahead and get your hands on one of these. Okay, so without any further ado, let's just jump straight into editing this photo. So this is the one we're going to be working off today, as well as I guess this one as well we're going to be looking at because it's got the flare and stuff. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you the photo that we're going to be editing. So it's this one here. You can see it's very similar to this particular photo here. So we're going to be editing this one here. But if we look at most of his photos, I just want to quickly talk to you about what he does in his photos to get this particular color grade. Now obviously, as you can see, he posts lots of different style color grades, and so he's got this one for example that's in a very kind of snow, obviously Lapland, Finland. We've got whites and blacks and greys and stuff, very contrast to, for example, this one which is really blue and yellow. So it's really hard to kind of tell what certain colors he does. That will depend on your photo. For example, this one's blues and greys, but this one's obviously vivid greens. But what we can do is look at the basic color grade of everything, which is what I like doing. So I have got a few requests of people telling me to kind of go into a bit more detail on how we edit these photos and how I know what settings will work or won't work. So first of all, let's just look at this photo here. Now I'm not sure if he takes these on the camera or if he takes these on his mobile phone, but the principles are basically the same. So this one will be a good one to work off. If you look here, he's got pretty bright highlights. This is probably the same across most of his images, but I think he fades them out. So you can see here, for example, these highlights in the background aren't purely stark white. They look a little bit faded out. His shadows as well, I think he's put a little bit of fade on his shadows. But you can see on this one he's got a little bit of grain going on as well, and you can see the grain up here. Quite sharp images, quite high contrast as well, so we want to be making sure we put a lot of contrast into our images. He seems to be brightening up those shadows because if you look at this one for example, he's got really bright highlights here, and he's got all the shadows that would be on this building he's kind of brought up, so we can see all the detail in the shadows where the sun wouldn't be falling on this building. He also likes using lots of flares. You can see it in this particular image, and as well the one we're going to be basing off, this one here as well. He's got lots of flares going on. And if you look at our image, we've got a flare coming up here, so that should work in our favour. But if you don't have a flare in your image, you can go ahead and just place in a flare in your photo just by going onto Photoshop. He seems to desaturate certain tones, warm up the image, so his temperature is kind of more to the warm side as opposed to the cool side. In terms of colours, it's going to be harder to tell, but I think we're going to work through the colours as we're editing the photo. But anyway, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at this photo and we're going to work through it step by step. Okay, so the first thing to notice is all of his photos seem to be pretty dark, so his exposure is usually a lot lower than, for example, our photo here. So obviously it depends on your photo, but I would suggest to take your exposure down a little bit. That's probably good, maybe a little bit more. Obviously the number will depend on your photo, but take the exposure down a little bit. Next thing is we're going to take up the contrast just a bit, put about +15, +20, and we're going to take our temperature. I think we can take ours down to about -2, -3. That's just because ours is a little bit too orange. If you see on his face, it's very orange up here. So we are going to take that down probably a tiny bit, but we do want a lot of that yellow colour in our photos. You can see he's got a lot there, so I might even go back and change that back to 0 later on. Okay, now in terms of highlights, as I said, he's got pretty bright highlights in all of his photos. You can see here, highlights here are really bright and really washed out. We're going to bring up our highlights a bit, 30, just so we can get this flare really bright at the top here. Now in terms of the shadows, I think he's brought the shadows up as well, so we're going to bring those up just to get a bit of detail in our shadows. This photo isn't too bad though, we've got quite a lot of detail in our shadows, but you might want to bring yours up a little bit more. In terms of our whites, we're also going to brighten those up as well, probably to about +30, +35. And then our blacks, I'm going to bring those down a bit just to bring in a little bit more contrast back into the image. Okay, so we're getting closer to his look of his photos. Now we're going to come down to the clarity, vibrance and saturation. Now in terms of clarity, I think he does add a small bit of clarity into his images. It is kind of hard to tell, but they are quite sharp, so I think it will benefit if we put a little bit of clarity into the photo, just to kind of make the highlights and the dark shadows really pop out. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are just going to boost that clarity just a bit, maybe up to about 38, 40. You can see that's really bringing out the really sharp highlights and the really dark shadows. So coming back to our reference photo here, I'm looking at these really bright highlights on his chin here, and around here. We've got those on our chin here. So as you can see, as I bring that up more, we get much more stark contrast between the really bright highlights and the really dark shadows. So I think probably about 30, 40 is probably good. We'll leave it at 38, I think that's a good value. In terms of vibrance and saturation, that's a slightly difficult one because it does depend on the photo you're trying to base it off. So for example, this one is pretty saturated, we've got pretty bright muted colours, but they're pretty bright. But in certain photos, for example, this one here is kind of more of a desaturated kind of look with the low highlights. So again, it really does depend on your image. But okay, so in order to get this particular look, bring up the saturation and bring down the vibrance, depending on which look you think looks better. I'm beginning to think actually that might look a little bit better. Yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to maybe bring up the vibrance just a little bit, maybe to about -23, and bring up our saturation to +24. Okay, so that's our basics panel pretty much sorted. If I did before and an after, you can see really darkened down the image and brought in that contrast and that sharpness. So if I compare the before to that and the after, you can see we're a lot closer to his look here. Okay, so then we're going to come down to the tone curve. Now this is the hard part because it's really hard to tell on his photos what he really does with the tone curve. But what we're going to do is we're going to fade off the shadows. We're going to bring up the blacks just to get a tiny bit of fade in the blacks. You can see the shadow here is pretty much a little bit of faded out here, and down here as well on the bottom of his jacket. Then I think we might just darken off the shadows a little bit just to get some pretty dark contrast on the shadows, and then maybe bring up the midtones and the highlights. Okay, so on our tone curve here, what we're going to do is we're going to put in our 3 points. I do this in pretty much every single one of our videos just to make a kind of standard, bog standard S-shape tone curve. So this basically means you can bring up and down until you get the nice S-shape. So what we're going to do first is we're going to fade off those blacks, so that our blacks kind of fade off and drop off here. This graph in the background means we don't really have much information down here on the blacks. So in order to get more of a fade, we're going to have to bring this point up here and then kind of fade that off. You can see that that's making the fade there because that's where we've got the information. And then we're just going to bring this one up here just to kind of give us that more of a gradual slope just to fade off those blacks there. So if you see if I turn it on and off, we've got a very soft and gradual fade. We don't want anything too drastic. Then in terms of our shadows, I'm just going to bring those up a little bit and the midtones as well, just to bring in that contrast. You can see immediately as soon as I bring up the midtones, we get this really contrast between the bright sun and the foreground shadows. In terms of the highlights, I'm just going to bring those up a little bit as well, just to really get those bright orange highlights going on here, and then I'm going to fade out those highlights at the top just a tiny bit, maybe not that much. Okay, I've just faded those off a little bit, so if I turn the tone curve off and turn it on again, you can see it's made a very subtle difference. If anything, I might bring up the fade a little bit more on the shadows. I think that should probably be a little bit better. There, we can see the fade now. And we've got a little bit more contrast essentially in the image. Okay, so that's the tone curve pretty much done. I think we're definitely on point to looking what his photo looks like. If anything, I might take the exposure back down a little bit further on our photo. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to come down to our hue, saturation and luminance panel. Okay, so the hue, saturation and luminance panel is slightly more complicated because, as I said earlier, it does depend on his photo. Each of his photos kind of go for a slightly different vibe. So you can see, for example, this one is very saturated, kind of vivid kind of look. We've got really bright saturated tones, whereas some of them are quite desaturated. This one, for example, and a slightly more orangey, kind of browny kind of coloured. So for our particular photo, we're going to be basing on like these few here, and this kind of style where he's got kind of dark browns and kind of warmer tones. I can do another video at some point doing more of his brighter, lighter colours if you wanted me to, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to base it off this particular photo. So for our oranges and our reds, so our reds are going to be basically in the background here on the roofs, and also a little bit on his skin colour and his face. You can see if I bring that left and right, it's going to change that. So we're not going to really do much with that. Skin colour is going to be on the red, so you don't really want to be tweaking that too much. Orange again is also going to be the skin colour. So if we bring that to the left, it's going to make it more pink, and to the right, it's going to make it more green. So you see really green or really pink. Now, personally, looking at this image, I'm thinking his jacket especially and his face has got a little bit too much green in it. So I might bring this down to probably about -5. Let's try -10, see what that looks like, but that might be a little bit too pink. I think that's looking good actually. -10 is a good value. Just to get rid of a little bit of that green. You can always come back to the tint up here and just bring it out to the right. I think I might do that as well. Just bring it out to maybe about +2 or +3, just to bring out a little bit of green. Coming down to the yellows, that's also going to control the colour of his jacket. So again, if we bring it to the right, it's going to be green. To the left, we can get more of that kind of reddy, orangey, pink kind of colour. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it down to the left to kind of get rid of that green as well, not -100. Probably to about -40, -45. Okay, then the next one is our greens here, and we don't really have many greens in this particular image, so we can't really do much with it. This colour down here is a little bit green, so I think we can bring that down to the left towards the kind of the yellowy kind of side, and to the right it kind of goes more to the kind of tealy kind of colours and vivid greens. So we're going to bring that all the way down to the left for our particular photo, just to get rid of that kind of green colour. In terms of the aquas and blues, blues you can see are going to be in the background here, especially in these windows, but not much else. You can see his is kind of more of a dark kind of teal kind of colour in his blues, and if you look on these windows here, so what we're going to do is our windows are pretty much the same colour as these windows, but I think I'm going to bring it down a little bit more towards a teal kind of colour. So I'm just going to bring mine down to -100. Now obviously for your image you probably don't want to be bringing it down that far, you probably only want to bring it down a subtle amount if you've got more blues in, but because the only blue we've got in our images here is just on these windows, so I'm going to bring mine all the way down to -100. Okay, now in terms of purple and magenta, we don't have any of those in our image, but so I'm just going to skip those and move straight on to saturation. Okay, now in terms of saturation, he has got a pretty brightly saturated or highly saturated yellows and oranges. You can see in his hands and this flare, for example, here, so it's pretty saturated. Ours is looking pretty desaturated compared to his at the moment. So what we're going to do is of the yellows and the oranges, we're going to bring those up. Probably to about +20. Nothing too drastic because it's going to look really strange if we bring it up too high, but trying that about +20, +18. I might come back and tweak those in a minute. In terms of saturation of the blues, I'm just going to bring those up as well, just kind of make sure you can see a little bit of the blue in the windows, and then everything else I'm just going to bring down in saturation a little bit. That's just so we can get the contrast between the foreground image essentially. Okay, now most of the edit is going to be done in luminance, quite interestingly on this photo, and that's because he's got quite a dark saturated look to his jacket and his face here. So what we are going to do is we are going to bring down the luminance of the oranges. Obviously not too much because then his face is going to look really strange, but probably to about -15 is probably a good value, just down a little bit. Maybe bring the yellows down to about -5 as well. Probably bring the reds down, maybe bring the reds up a little bit, just to get a little bit brighter on the flare over here. Blues, I'm going to bring those up as well, just to brighten up the windows. Actually, what I've decided to do is bring up the luminance of the oranges. That's just so we can get a little bit more brightness to his skin colour, his skin tone, and bring down the luminance of the jacket, of the yellow. So I'm bringing that down to probably to about -15, -20, and maybe bring up the orange luminance to about +9. Okay, so that is our HSL slider, or all of our tone curve and our basics panel done. So that is basically the most amount of the edit that we can really get done. And if I do the before and the after, you can see the before really does not look like that image, but the after, we've really got that kind of look to the photo. Now the next thing we can do is split toning. So what I like to do with split toning is put up my saturation to about +10, +12 of the highlights, and then you can go through and you can scrub through until you get what works best. Okay, so split toning is slightly more complicated to really make sure you get the look you want. What I do like to do is look at the individual photo that you're going to be basing your picture on, because overall he will probably change his split toning on depending on each photo and depending on what look he's going for. But the split toning in general, I think on the photos that we're trying to design it for this one here, is you can see in the shadows here, for example, this one's slightly better to look at. The shadows are slightly more blue and the highlights are kind of much more like orangey kind of coloured. So that's the look we're going to be going for. You can see here as well, slightly difficult to see on this one because there's not so many highlights. Okay, apologies if the audio has suddenly started sounding a little bit different, a little bit strange. That's because someone has suddenly started to do some hoovering downstairs. So obviously you're going to start hearing some weird background noises, but I do apologise about that, but not much I can do. So I'm just going to continue on now. As I was saying, the highlights here you can see around his chin and around his lips, really kind of more towards the orangey kind of side, and down here in the shadows on his jacket, and down here it's kind of more towards the tealy dark blue kind of colour. So going back to our image, what we're going to do is we're going to put our saturation up to about 10 or 12 on our highlights, and then go for the value of 35. Now that is a good value to go for if you're trying to get orange highlights. You can see if I hold down the Alt key and click, you can see it's a bright orange kind of colour. You can bring it more to the reds if you bring it to the left, or bring it more towards the yellows and greens if you bring it to the right. But I kind of quite like the value of 35. It's a good number, gets that nice bright orange on his highlights here. So now you can see if we compare the colour on these highlights around his arms and around his face here, really much more similar to this one. Now what we can do is come down to the shadows. We can do the same thing. We can put our saturation up to about 12. We might bring the saturation down a little bit later on, and we're going to put our shadows on 230. Now that is also a blue kind of colour, so if I hold down Alt and show you can see the colour we're getting there. So okay, so in order to get a slightly more accurate look to ERIK's one, we're going to go slightly to the left, probably down to about 209. That's kind of more towards the greeny tealy blues. As you can see, his photo looks ever so slightly green undertones, whereas if you bring it too far to the right, we kind of get more of that purple kind of undertone look. Okay, so that is the split toning done. What we might do is bring down the saturation of the shadows maybe a little bit, maybe down to about +10. Okay, then coming down to the sharpening, what I like to do is just click this and bring it over his face, for example here. But as I said at the beginning of the video, his images are pretty sharp and have a bit of grain in them. Now we can achieve this grain by adjusting our grain slider later on, but also you can get grain if you add a lot of sharpening to the image. So we're going to add quite a bit of sharpening to the image just to get a lot more detail in the image. Maybe not +79, it's a little bit too much, maybe about +50, and we're going to leave the radius at 1. In terms of detail, we're going to bring up a little bit as well. This just kind of makes the sharpening a little bit smaller, a little bit tighter in on the image. Noise reduction we're going to leave it as standard, and we're not going to touch the colour or the lens corrections. Coming down to effects, we're going to come down to the grain, and we are going to add a bit of grain into the image. So I think about +30 is a good amount. We don't really adjust the size too much. His grain is kind of mid-range size, it's not too small, so I think 25 on the size is probably good enough. Okay, so coming down to the camera calibration, there's not really much we really want to do on this one, but that's kind of more personal preference. If you do want to kind of change it to kind of look a little bit different, you can come down and adjust these sliders. So for the blue prime, you can bring it to the left if you want to kind of get more of that kind of pinky kind of tones to this particular image, and you can bring your red primary to the right to kind of get that almost orange and teal kind of vibe to the image, and then maybe bring the green primary up to about +21. I'm just going to desaturate the blue primary a little bit to about -30, -40, and then maybe saturate the reds or the red primary just to kind of get a little bit more of that bright orange going on in the picture. Okay, so that is basically the end of the video, guys. I'm just going to put that one in full screen so you can see the image there. Now if I do the before and the after, you can see how much of a difference that's made. So if I compare the before photo, for example, to his photo here, then the after photo, you can see the colour of the jacket is, we've got a lot more closer to the look of his colour of the jacket here, and kind of more contrast image, a little bit more clarity, sharpness, and we've got those bright orange highlights and those dark blue shadows. Okay, so that is the end of the video, guys. There it is in full screen. I really hope that has helped you guys out in terms of trying to get more of a similar look to ERIK CONOVER. What you can do now is just to do a minor tweak that you might want to do in the photo, because he has got lots of flares in his photo. One thing you can do in Photoshop, for example, is, in Lightroom, is get your ellipse tool here and just kind of drag it out to a large size, and bring it up to where you want your flare to be, which is about here. Just click Invert Mask, and then brighten up your exposure, probably quite high, probably to about 1.08. Bring that more towards the orange sides if you really wanted to, just kind of give it that orange tint. So you can see that really puts in a really bright kind of highlight going on there. You might want to bring it down a little bit, maybe bring the saturation down just a tiny bit, maybe to about -8. So there we go, guys. You can see we've got a really bright flare going on here. Probably closer to the look of these ones here. You see with the bright flare going on over his shoulder here. So there we go, guys, that is the end of the video. I really hope that I've kind of replicated his style as best as I could, and hopefully you guys can see that we've kind of done our best to kind of get his look to this particular photo here. So once again, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do go ahead and check out our website, go and check out our merchandise and stuff, and don't forget, of course, to go ahead and subscribe. And hopefully we'll see you in the next video, guys. Live long and prosper.